I think that culturally and sometimes even religiously, we've done a real disservice to ourselves in creating a fairy tale version of the gospel that looks like if you sort of try hard and do these things and don't do these things, then everything will turn out in this kind of Nordstrom catalog sort of a way. And my favorite thing about my faith is that I believe that because of God's perfect love, as manifested most importantly through the gift of our Heavenly Parent's Son, Jesus Christ, the fairy tale can burn down. It can be totally obliterated, and there is still a meaningful, substantive, true thing, even after all of that fairy tale has gone away.
It is time for another episode of The Cultural Hall, and I'm going to do this one a little bit different. Today, we're talking about when church is hard. Not only the action of like when going to church is hard, but that's the title of the book and the author, Tyler P. Johnson. Welcome into The Cultural Hall.
Thanks so much for having me, Richie. I'm glad to be here.
It took us nothing shy of 1,001 emails to be able to connect and to have this interview. A huge shout out to JC over at Deseret Book. That is where this book is available, among other places. You'll be able to find a link in the show notes to be able to purchase this if this feels like a valuable resource. And if it wasn't valuable, we wouldn't be having the conversation. So I want to give you that recommendation for sure. Before we go any further, Tyler P. Johnson, what does the P stand for?
Paul.
Paul. Okay, good Bible name. Is that why the family did it, or are there a string of Pauls?
Well, actually, I have this very vivid memory from when I was growing up that we had this like family home evening lesson and heard this very rousing pioneer story. And at the end, at the end of the rousing pioneer story, the like big reveal was, and that is how you, my younger brother, that is how you got your name. You are named after this person. And I was like, oh my gosh, names work like that? I thought names were just names, but names are like a thing. So then, of course, I turned to my parents and I was like, so who am I named after? And they're like, oh, we just liked your name.
Yeah,
So
perfect. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. Especially after doing the whole family home evening, like it at least could be something like, listen, your mom was really infatuated with the Beatles growing up. She traveled around. Like it could at least be something like that.
Yep, but they just liked it, at least
Nice.
as far as I know.
Nice. So no sort of meaning. And the Johnsons, you've got to be related to a Pioneer Johnson for sure.
There are lots of pioneers in lots of different directions. So there, both of my parents grew up in Utah, and both, I mean, it gets complicated. My dad's parents actually were very recently Johansons, and then the name got changed when they came over to America, which was not, it was probably 2.5 generations ago or something. And then on my mom's side, also those roots go back in Utah even further, although I don't know exactly how many years.
Yeah. People listening to this have already done your genealogy and you go, oh, he's from the Johansson line of, and they get on and on and on. That's how some people work. Honestly, we have people that'll be like, well, you know who he's related to. Now, let me ask you this about that. You have written a book called When Church is Hard. What do you know about church being hard?
Well, yeah, actually, I think that's a really good question to start with because I think the primary thing that I want people to know is that I know that I don't know I don't know in a lived way. I don't know in a sort of in my body kind of way just how hard church is for a lot of people. And the people who read the book will discover that a lot of what I do in the book is tell stories, but most of the stories are stories that have been told to me or stories that I have read or stories that I have encountered, which is to say that, like, I mean, there have definitely been, as I have grown older, there are definitely there are things in church that have become increasingly difficult for me, but I would say that for me, it's mostly been in a sort of a more of a almost a theoretical way or an intellectual way.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that there are a lot of people for whom church is hard in a lived experience, day to day, like just the act of showing up can be really difficult. So just let me give one quick example. I remember talking to a woman a number of years ago who many people who are listening may know that around the time that President Nelson was, after he had first been ordained as prophet, he talked about how women needed to uh, raise their voices in defense of Christ and needed to be vocal and out there and needed to be an influence for good in the world. And
Mm-hmm.
shortly after he made some of those comments, I had a long discussion with a woman who's a friend of mine who said, "Okay, but like we say that, and yet I go to general conference and I look up at the dais or the big red chairs, and depending on exactly what year you're talking about, it used to be that it was not even necessarily the general presidency of the Relief Society and primary and young women sat up there, but even if they're sitting up there, right, you have whatever nearly 100 men
Mm-hmm.
and just a handful of women. And then if you look at the amount of time that is spent in general conference, even if you say, well, apostles, prophets, seers, and revelators, they have sort of a special calling to be heard every 6 months. But even if you accept them and still look at the time that is remaining and how it's divided between men and women, this woman said, I just don't understand. Like, there's no doctrinal, there's no logical reason why general conference time couldn't be split 50-50, or at least certainly much more than the 95-5 or whatever the split is now. Why would that be? As a woman, this person was telling me, I just feel like my voice is not represented, or like I'm not equally valued. And the reason I tell that story is because, as silly as it will probably sound to a lot of people, when I had that discussion with this friend of mine, that had just never occurred to me in that way. And which I think is a great example of the fact that, here I had been going to general conference for, however many 30 something year, I mean, going, watching, whatever.
Sure.
Anyway, for 30 something years. And that had just never occurred to me. And so all of that is to say that I don't want to, by any stretch, claim to know in a lived way just how hard church is for anybody else except for me. And I recognize that as it goes, my time in church, I think in a lot of sort of demographic and logistical ways has probably been a lot easier than a lot of other people's.
Sure. Sure. But then that asks the question, has there been a time when church has been hard for you personally?
Sure. I mean, I think that as I have gotten older, I have, I think that one of the really beautiful things about the church in a lot of ways is that if you grow up in a family that is sort of all into churchdom, it's this sort of enveloping reality, right? There was a great essay. I work with Wayfair, which is this literary magazine, and we published this great essay a while back called "The Calendar," where this college student recounted how, looking back now, even as a college student, he recognizes that when he was growing up, church dictated the calendar of his life, right? It said, "What do you do on Sundays? What do you do on Monday nights and Tuesday nights?" And all this kind of stuff. And I think that, and I cite that only to say that I think that if you grow up in the church, it's easy for that to just feel like it is reality, right?
Mhm.
But as I have grown older, and I went to college, then I went to medical student. As I have read more broadly and spoken with other people from other places more broadly, I have come to care a lot about, for example, I'll just give you one example. I've come to care a lot about racial equality and about the way that we as people engage with racial relations in the United States and also locally, in whatever place that I've lived. And so, in that sense, though, of course, I have never, as a white guy, I've never felt the sting of racism at
Sure.
church. Um, when I read, for example, Paul Reeves' book, which also published by Deseret Book, about the history of the racially based restriction on temple attendance and holding the priesthood, that even though it's only vicarious, it's really hard for me, right? Because it's not just a question of that the restriction was there. It's a question of what did leaders of our church, who I, have always thought about as people to revere and admire, the way that they talked about Black people and the way that some of them actively agitated to try to keep that policy in place even longer, as long as it was, and then even longer than it was, and other things, right? And those kinds of questions are hard for me.
Mhm.
It makes me really sad to know that a church that I value and love and that has provided so many blessings in my life is also a place that it often feels like the more you learn about it, the more complicated it is. The
Sure.
same thing is true, I think, if you think about Joseph Smith. I remember and this is having grown up as a person who, I feel like actually I was pretty lucky in that my dad was very eyes wide open about Joseph Smith's life and talked to us about most of the controversial aspects of his life and whatever. But nonetheless, reading Rough Stone Rolling when it came out in 2005 or thereabouts, there were still a lot of things that I had not been aware of, right?
Sure. Sure.
And and so I think coming to learn that Joseph Smith's life was much more complicated than the very sort of uh, linear version that I had learned growing up was also a thing that, something that I've really had to grapple with.
Sure. Just so you don't feel like you're the only one sharing, I'll share with you as recent as this last Sunday, I have a new calling where I'm in charge of making sure that the people that can't make it to the building are able to watch it. And I was trying to do something way above and beyond of what I needed to do, and it wasn't working. And I can think multiple times of when I sat in sacrament meeting and I was like, I don't want church to be hard. I hate this. I hate that this is like this. I hate that I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling right now, that I don't want to be burdened with this thing. Now, granted, I'm making it accessible to all these people, but I genuinely was like, this is so hard. That's trivial. The first Sunday after I was excommunicated, I'm recent, or not recently, but I have been rebaptized. But I remember sitting in the parking lot after being excommunicated on a Tuesday, right? Because that's when they hold the meeting, and they're like, "Hey, go home," and then tomorrow, when you have the chance to purchase some other underwear, you'll be able to take the garment off, don't wear it, and sort of dismiss. And that first Sunday after that, sitting in the parking lot, going, "Well, listen, if God doesn't want me, why am I going? Why am I coming back here? Why would I enter in the building? Why would this be a thing?" And I would imagine there's lots of people that have never experienced this. Is the idea behind when church is hard is that it's hard for everybody. Open your eyes, everyone. It's hard for everyone. We're a bunch of people trying to make their way through a hard thing, or what would you tell people about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think two things can both be true here. I think that on the one hand, I think it's really important so Elder Maxwell used to like to say, only Jesus can compare crosses. And I think that that's true, right?
Sure.
So I claim no ability to know what it is like to be in anybody else's shoes with regard to anything, but specifically within the context of this conversation with regard to how hard church is. And I want to make it clear that, and I think that it is objectively true that church is harder for some people than it is for other people for a whole bunch of different reasons. Um, and I think it is also true that, I really love Melissa Inouye, her writing and her sort of way of engaging with these things. And one of the things that she talked about was that, uh, so she said she was a PhD historian, scholar of sort of religious history. And she said that if you are a scholar of religious history, you get to the point where you learn that great visions, like what we often call the first vision, and also grand plans for, revising the world and making things better and whatever, those are actually, even though they seem really hard to come up with, those are actually a dime a dozen in the world of religious history. Like those are happening all the time.
Hmm.
But the thing that almost never happens is that a religious movement, or rarely happens, is able to build a durable, meaningful, actual community, like with real people in it. that, keep showing up.
Mhm.
And I think that that is the thing that is, I guess, the most striking to me about the church is how real it is, right? It's not some like theoretical thing up on a PowerPoint slide or a chalkboard that you can just, I mean, you can talk about it that way. You could draw like an org chart and whatever, and that's all
Sure.
fine. But like, that doesn't actually have any power. What has power is actually being at the place and being with the people. But to your point, as soon as that becomes true, then we have to deal with the fact that it's really hard to be in close quarters with other humans dealing with all of the stuff that comes up in life, right?
Mhm.
and and that and it is also where we deal with a lot of the hardest stuff that comes up in life. And so in a sense, yes, I think church is hard because life is hard, right? Like, and because people are hard and relationships are hard and all of the best things are hard. And so in a sense, the fact that the place where we engage with all of those very real things, the fact that it should be hard maybe should surprise us less than it does. Now, to be clear, I also want to just put out there that I think a lot of times we don't do ourselves any favors in this regard because we often want to pretend like there's some clause in the scriptures somewhere that says, well, if you just try really hard to do all the right things, then life won't be hard, right?
Sure.
We sort of act as if we think that that's true or that the church won't be hard or whatever.
Right.
But that doesn't actually, first of all, that's not scriptural. And secondly, it doesn't make very much sense.
Mhm. I want to take a quick break because the title of the book also leads me a different way. So I want to, rather than like conflating these two different discussions, I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to pick it back up when church is hard and in maybe a different way. Prescriptive maybe is what I'm wondering. Let's take a break, come back in the second block, and we'll talk about that.
Imagine running a small business today. It's challenging. Imaging and internet presence is an absolute must. Even with that, you're still a small star in a bright cyber universe. Now, imagine you have someone who understands how to get your site designed for your talents and then easily searched by potential clients. Imagine Lennon Design. Whether it's strictly a website or a whole package of logo creation, advertising media, and promotional materials, Lennon Design is your partner in business. They'll test the boundaries of their imagination to create something unique for you. When you need creative, affordable design, let it be Lennon Design. Call 801-699-3022 or visit LennonDesign.com.
Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember that you can become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall. Go to patreon.com/the Cultural Hall, where for as little as $5 a month, you can become a part of the secret but not sacred Facebook group where all the Patreon saints are hanging out. It's tangential conversations. It's first access to the episodes. And really, it just says to me, hey, I value what you've spent 13 years of your life doing. Patreon.com/the Cultural Hall. So with the title, Tyler, When Church is Hard, I almost, when I got the book, I get sent the book, the opportunity to be able to read it, etc. I almost thought that it would be like, well, when church is hard, pray, read your scriptures, get up. That in story is certainly not as prescriptive as it sounds. Is that what you were hoping? Is it's like, here's a book, we talk about a lot of things and now do something about it? Is there an action of when church is hard, ...
That's a good question. So I think the argument I'm trying to make is a couple of things. So the first thing, in a funny way, I suppose, is to say that if church is hard for you, don't either A, think you're the only one who feels that way, or B, feel that that means that you are broken or spiritually second rate or somehow, coming in for a consolation prize or something, right? Because I think there's a particular way of understanding, not so much our doctrine, but more our culture that seems to suggest that if it's hard, that means something is wrong with you. And so I think it's really important to say that I don't think that's true. And I don't think that our scriptures, and I actually don't think that, taken fully in context, I don't think that our modern prophetic discourse or our scriptures or anything else support that idea. So that's thing number one. And then thing number two is that I think that there is another strange piece. This is partly, I think, our own cultural fault, and partly, I think, a thing that kind of comes to us from wider cultural circles. But then there is also this idea that if I once was in a place where I felt certain or all but certain of various church truth claims or the truth of the church writ large or whatever, and so then at that point, I thought, well, of course I'm going to do all of the things because, like, I'm going to invest in a life of discipleship because I have this sense of certainty or near certainty.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in that place, and then later I'm in a place where I do not feel that I'm in that place of certainty, then I think there can be a sense that it's kind of like, it's at least expected and maybe even ethically better somehow to sort of ease off on a life of discipleship, so that the idea becomes that it's as if we only engage in a life of discipleship if we feel that doing that is sort of obligated because of this sense of certainty that we have, and that if we don't have that sense of certainty, then there is no longer good reason to engage in a life of discipleship. And so the thing that I'm trying to suggest is that there may be beauty and meaning and faith to be found in a life of Christian discipleship, even when we no longer feel certain, or maybe especially when we no longer feel certain. And in fact, I would argue that much of the Book of Mormon and also in the New Testament, I would argue that there's a lot of scriptural support for the fact that we've kind of flipped the equation on its head, in the sense that we have created this culture where we expect certainty or something like certainty to be the natural state of affairs, and almost act as if then, if it isn't, then something is wrong with us, and that calls into question the whole project of being a Christian disciple. But I would argue that actually a lot of the scriptures indicate to us that we should expect not to feel certain about spiritual things most of the time, and that engaging in a life of discipleship is something that we do almost to some degree in spite of our current level of certainty or lack of certainty of any particular, like, truth claim or what have you.
Now, you've used the word discipleship a few times. I'd like to know how you define Christian discipleship or discipleship.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of those words that is, I really love Emma Lou Thane, who was a friend until she died a number of years ago. She's the woman who wrote the lyrics to Where Can I Turn for Peace, and was also a wonderful poet in her own right. She liked to say that ultimately religion is as personal as your shadow. And I feel a lot like discipleship is that way too, in the sense that, what it means to be a disciple, I think, is something that a person has to sort of determine largely between themselves and God. But for my money, I guess that I feel like being a disciple is largely about, I guess I would phrase it in two ways. One way is the kids' song. I think it's I'm trying to be like Jesus, recognizing, of course, that all of us have an imperfect and filtered through 2,000 years of history and, cultural lenses and a whole bunch of other things, idea of who Jesus was and what Jesus would do. But nonetheless, I'm trying to be like Jesus. And then I think it's largely about trying to find where the world is hurting and figure out how can you try to make that better. And the last thing I'll add about that is that I think that most often that project of trying to figure out where the world is hurting, like, I'm not saying that there's no place for, social media posts or grand plans for how to affect change in the world. But most of the time, I think the way that we do most of the most meaningful work in terms of healing the wounds that are in the world looks pretty local, right? It looks like the person sitting next to me at church, or the, person who needs help with their kids, or the person who, just had a baby and needs some help with food, or whatever those things are that sometimes we can be really beautifully good at, I think, in the church. I think that often is what discipleship looks like.
How much of your book, or the idea or the thrust of your book, was sort of post-pandemic? I think there was, I'm generalizing, allow me to generalize, everyone, that there was a certain essence of when it was like, come back to the building, that we all were like, yeah, this is hard. This is hard. And I'm a believer, and I did the sacrament meeting in my house. I did all the things. This is hard. How much of it is that?
There's no, I mean, I can't really claim any connection between the pandemic um and the book, because the book had been in development for, a long time. I've sort of written it in the nooks and crannies of time over the course of many years. But I do think that there is I mean, the one thing that I will say, one thing that I talk about a lot in the book is that one thing that I think the church offers in a way that I did not fully grasp until the pandemic is a meaningful in-person community, right? Like, I remember, especially, living in California for the first year plus of the pandemic, it was kind of like being on house arrest a lot of the time. I mean, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but, like, playgrounds were closed, church buildings were closed, movie theaters were closed. And I know this is true for everybody to some degree, but, the degrees differed depending on your public health department and whatever. And in Northern California, it was taken very seriously. And there was just almost no contact with other people for a long time. And so I put that out there just to say that, something as simple as sitting in pews with people that I know and singing hymns together, like, gosh, how I missed that all of a sudden when you couldn't do that for more than a year, right? Or like even just this last Sunday, like sitting across and looking over at this other family, and just the reality of struggling with kids through sacrament meeting, but like watching that happening, right? Like, it's just there's just something about being there physically present with other people that I think is really powerful, and that the pandemic taught me that in a way that I don't think I ever could have understood it if not for that.
So if someone is engaging in this show, they're listening and they're like, church is hard for me for whatever reason, right? It can be any number of concerns, doctrinal, or, we're in the heap of political things right now that can be difficult for some folks. Doesn't matter. It's hard there, period. How do you walk through general principles? Are there things that people can do? You're finding the church is hard. Like, what? Now what? Great. Tyler, yes, church is hard, very hard. I'm thinking about not going anymore.
So, first, I want to make it really, really clear, and I say this explicitly in the book, that the book is not meant to compel behavior. In other words, what I do not want, even out of love and with all respect, I don't want people taking this book and taking it to someone they love who doesn't go or is thinking of not going and saying, well, see, now you have to, or, some version of that. Like, that totally misses the point of the book. So I just want to be clear about that. Because ultimately, I say this at the beginning of the book, I think that even the word, the church, right? Like, if I say, like you say, well, the church is hard, and I say whatever, but like, even what the word the church means is totally different for every person, right? Because yes, a part of it is this like theoretical thing about, it has a certain structure and a certain way that it functions and whatever. But then really what most of us mean when we say the church is made up almost entirely of our own experiences and our own sort of whatever. And so I want to be very clear about that. I think though that the I think that it is worth recognizing that there are two elements that I point to in the book that are that the church offers that I think are deeply meaningful. And so the way that I sort of the way that I formulate those in the book is that I talk about our theology and our lived religion. And I think that I'm no I have no formal training in religious history or theology. I don't have a PhD in anything. Uh, that said, I spend a lot of time talking with people and I spend a lot of time reading, and I think that it is fair to say that our theology can, go and stand right up there in the line with other major philosophical and theological traditions. I'm not here to compare theology and say whose is the best, but I think that it's meaningful and substantive, and it has real things to say about the real problems that real people have in their real lives. And then the second part, which I've alluded to already a little bit, talking about the power of community, is the power of lived religion. And that's not nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at that in a lot of different ways, but I think that, it's not for nothing, for example, that there was a set of researchers, nothing to do with the church, at the University of Pennsylvania, in collaboration with some other places, who basically went out and measured what they call pro-social or civic behavior. So things like volunteering in your neighborhood and voting and, trying to get people in a positive way interested in politics and that kind of stuff. And what they found is, so they went out and did a bunch of surveys and, saw how much time and effort and whatever resources people spent doing those pro-social kinds of things. And then they divvied up the data in a bunch of different groups, basically to say, is there a group that is particularly good, or are there some groups that are particularly good at these kinds of pro-social behaviors? And what they found is that of all of the demographic groups that they looked at, the one that sort of rose to the top in terms of that demonstrating that kind of pro-social behavior were members of our church. Now, I'm not here to crow about that. I'm not saying, well, therefore we're the best and that's not the spirit of this. But what I'm saying,
scoreboard.
yeah,
No,
right.
not, okay.
But what I am saying is that, first of all, that's not nothing. And secondly, it kind of makes sense, right? Like you grow up and you go to service projects and you know what it means to go fix the yard of the widow who, in other contexts you would never even have any contact with, right? Maybe you go and on Sundays and you take the sacrament to people who are too sick to come to sacrament meeting. Like, I would ask, when else in modern life does a 13-year-old boy end up in the home of a 90-year-old person who can't get out of bed because they're so weak, doing something as sort of mundane and ordinary in a lot of ways, but like taking them the sacrament? Like, I mean, obviously there are other contexts, other religions, whatever, but I'm just saying that is increasingly becoming a very rare kind of thing, right? But that's a thing that we just do almost as a matter of course. It's just kind of part of, it's just kind of woven into the fabric of what it means to be a church member. And so now I want to be clear, none of that makes the hard stuff not hard, right? And I'm not, and I say also explicitly in the book, and I want to say it explicitly here, like, there nowhere in the book is there like, Tyler's 10-step foolproof method for making church easy, or right? Like, that is not the spirit of the book at all. But I do think that it is worth just pausing to consider the significant beauty and power that are there in the theology and in the lived religion. And by extension, that there is, I think, a thing to living a life of Christian discipleship. I think that is a meaningful endeavor, even when it's hard.
Let me ask you this. You had the opportunity to serve in leadership over youth, correct, Bishop? Why I say Bishop?
Yep.
Now, these are people that are coming to you, and if I know one thing about the rising generation, they don't have any sort of problem to say, yeah, I saw this on the internet. This is the thing. I read this. Someone told me this. I was telling someone I was this thing, and they said that we did this. How, in the confines of a leadership perspective, are you able to have these conversations with people? Because I guess on some level, just like a parent with a child, you have a responsibility to be there, to listen, to hear, to want them to continue to come. Like, how were you able to balance that? That's a whole different set of things.
I think what you just said is just right. That I think 90% of, I mean, in many respects, this book, as much as anything, is an act of listening.
Mm-hmm.
It is it is talking about things that I learned largely, not entirely, but largely by just sitting and listening. And, the thing that has been my experience is that it is, I think that, well, oftentimes we have an idea that people are, who have really deep-seated questions about the church, that there's this whole like list of reasons that, well, maybe it's because they just want to go sin, or maybe it's because
They're
they are,
lazy.
yeah, or whatever, right? There's all these things. Now, look, are there people who just, kind of don't give a hang? Sure, I'm sure because there are those people in any group,
Sure.
whatever, right? Are there people who want to go sow their wild oats? Sure, I'm sure there are those people too. But what I'm saying is that the people who struggle with this, the people who really care about it deeply, are, in my experience, virtually never like that.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, they are people who are saying, I am trying to bring the very best of myself to this endeavor. And when I do that, like there's this part of the best that I'm trying to bring that just doesn't square with this thing that I'm seeing in church. And that's really painful to me. Like, I don't understand why there would be this sort of, like, why I would feel torn when I'm just trying to bring the best of myself.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, that's sort of the first, second, and third thing for me to remember, is that it is almost always a good idea, in my experience, to assume good intentions until someone does something to prove otherwise. And in virtually every encounter that I have had with anybody who wants to talk about this stuff, when I assume those good intentions, they are virtually always borne out in the end.
So a lesson on listening then for people, because I think that that's one thing that resonates time and time again, is like being able to not only know these stories so that you can share them, but like listening to understand them so that you could be able to share them, or so that you could understand and become greater because of them, or whatever the circumstances may be. I think that this is people certainly, but I know that this is people within the church where it's like, I struggle with race in the priesthood. Well, you need to know a lot of things. You need to know a lot of it's the time and it's the people, and then we as leadership, as fellow saints, just even in the pews, we don't deal well with other people's hard. How would you recommend, if someone is sort of hearing you and going like, man, I want to show up like that for someone? Are there things that you would recommend? And I know this will only be your lived experience, but are there things that you have kind of lived by so that people don't rush to go, well, you're reading that incorrectly. Well, it's not that way anymore. Well, it's get past the past, or we have a prophet, all those dismissive things that take away the hard from people.
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things there. One is just on a sort of a human relation. So I'm a cancer doctor, right? And there's a lot of hard in being a cancer. I mean, not for me, but for my patients. There's a lot of hard stuff. And I guess that one thing I have learned maybe from doing that, but that also feels helpful here, is that the idea that we're going to do a thing that's going to make the hard go away is almost always an illusion. Like, hard just is. I mean, for heaven's sake, we are we have the Book of Mormon, and we should be able to read Second Nephi chapter 2 and know that it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. Like Lehi seems to suggest there that hard is just woven into the fabric of the universe. It's not like a bug in the system that we're going to like, program out in version 3.0. It just is. And so like, because that's the case, I think that the first thing is to sort of what you're alluding to is to just sort of relax into like, not relax, but become comfortable with the hard. The hard, I mean, to the title of the book, the hard is to be expected. It is part of being human. The second thing is that when we talk with people, we often make the mistake of thinking that communication is principally about the exchange of knowledge, right? So it's literally like, I'm going to take these facts and I'm going to like put them over here into you or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But actually, I mean, certainly we do that, and certainly that's an important part of communication, but much of communication is actually much more about emotional resonance than it is about, let me take a fact and put it in your brain, right? And so as a consequence, if someone comes to us, I don't think I have ever met a person who ever wanted to talk about any aspect of hard church who was not feeling a lot of emotions. But if they come to us in effect saying, I am having really difficult emotions, and our reaction is, oh, fact, right? Like that is just like the person, it's like if you imagine the exchange that way, right? It's like, I am feeling really sad about this, or this is like existentially tearing me apart. And then we're like, oh, fact, and another fact, right? Like that's just not what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's if they, I mean, to Jesus's example, right? That's like them asking for a fish and we give them a stone. Mm-hmm. And so if the only thing that we do is to recognize that almost always this is a question of emotion before it's a question about cognitive gaps, about facts, then we can say things like, wow, it sounds like this is really weighing on you. It sounds like this is really hard. I just want you to know, however hard it is and however long the hard lasts, I'm here for you, come what may.
Knowing that that you're a cancer doctor, and then having that sort of laid in with that, is it different for you professionally than it is with you religiously, or would you say it's all the same?
Well, I think that there's a lot of, I mean, there are definitely different tools that have to be brought to, different parts of the two things, but I think that there is actually the thing that both of those discussions bring into really stark relief is the hard stuff of life, right? Like sometimes I probably get a little bit, I probably have an unrealistically, I don't know. I probably have an unrealistic sense of just how hard everybody's life is, because for my patients, for example, it's almost always hard, right? Either they're like going through chemo to try to get rid of cancer, or they're going through chemo even though they know they're not going to get rid of the cancer, or what, like, that's just sort of that's like what every day is like. And I recognize that not everybody has a job that has them doing that kind of stuff all day, every day, right?
Yeah.
But I would also say, and this actually felt like a thing also that was maybe a little bit, I feel like the pandemic, one thing about the pandemic, which you asked about earlier, that was instructive, whatever else it was or wasn't, was the fact that I felt like because all of us knew that everybody was going through something that was like, world historically hard, mm-hmm. It sort of opened this space to be like, I'm having a really hard time in a way that maybe sometimes we wouldn't be so open to doing that, precisely because it was just because everybody was willing to recognize the difficulty of life, which is just to say that maybe it would be the case that if everybody were totally transparent, I don't mean this in any way as like accusatory or like I don't know the right word, sensationalistic or something, but I'm just saying it might be the case that the people that we think like, oh, that woman, she's got it all figured out. Like all of her, her kids are all perfect and her house is all perfect and her this and her that, or oh, the Relief Society president or the stake president or the, whatever, like, well, they've got it all figured out. My guess is that none of us has it figured out, right? Some of us do a better job of looking like we have it figured out than others, but none of us actually has it figured out. And so I think there is a sense in which that's actually kind of what church is a place where everybody doesn't have it. It's not the place where like the people who don't have it figured out go to meet with the people who have it figured out so that those people can teach the people who don't have it figured out how to have it figured out.
Right.
Rather, it's just a place where we all don't have it figured out. And we go to be in real community to try to help each other in the midst of everybody not having it figured out.
Yeah. I want to take another break. When we come back in the third block, there are 3 questions that we ask everyone who steps into the Culture Hall. I will ask those of you plus one other question I want to talk about. We'll come back and do that in the third block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJinUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJinUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now, BestDJinUtah.com. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always send us an email, contact@theculturalhall.com. We'd love to get that feedback. If you think of a great guest, maybe you read a book, you want to give feedback on this particular episode, I'm not going to tell you what to write an email about. I'm just going to tell you that the email address is contact@theculturalhall.com. And even if you take issue with something that is said in this episode or others, we love hearing, because otherwise we go, did anyone care? Does anyone care at all? Is anyone listening? Does this matter? Does anyone, are you out there? Are there ears? Contact@theculturalhall.com. So the title of the book, When Church is Hard, I don't like it. I'll be honest with you. I like Church is Hard because I think that it is. And I think that the people that, and I'm glad, I'm so grateful. I was worried when I started this off, when I was going to say, when has church been hard for you, that you were going to not, it hasn't been hard for me ever. I've lived a life of, and we all know those people, and I can't relate to those people. I think church is hard, as life is hard, as relationships are hard, as, hard is. It is that very thing with opposition. You are strengthened through opposition. You grow through opposition. You're able to have these things because it is hard. So I don't know if you got to pick it, if they said, here's the title of your book, Tyler, but if there's a reprint, Church is Hard, that's what I'm pushing for. I just want you to know.
Okay.
He's like, no, I'm not taking issue with that. The 3 questions we ask everyone that steps into the Cultural Hall, I'll ask of you right now. The first question is do you have a calling right now? And if so, what is it?
Yes, I'm the Sunday school president and I teach institute.
Now, being the Sunday school president, do you engage as a Sunday school president in a big way, or are you the guy that's like, got the roles done, we're good?
That's a good question. I mean, I will be honest that the Sunday school president is one of the callings where it's a little bit less clear to me how to engage in a big way than some of the other callings that I have had. I teach sometimes, which is probably the biggest way that I engage, and I sort of keep things organized, but it's not, I've had some callings where I devote an enormous amount of time, and this has not been one of those.
But you said you also teach institute. Tell me what that experience is like.
Yeah, Teaching Institute is sort of my favorite thing. So I've been very lucky to, there's sort of two parallel institute programs here, and there's a sort of an on-campus version and an off-campus version, and I've taught in both versions over a number of years now. And that's I recognized, I don't know, 10 or so years ago that teaching just in general and anything is sort of my favorite thing. And so being able to teach about this stuff that I care about a lot and being able to do it in a spirit of candor and faith is something that I really value, and that I do spend a lot of time on.
Do you have a particular either year? We sort of divide things in. It's Doctrine and Covenants year. It's Book of Mormon year. Do you have a particular subject that you love to teach or to study about?
I really love the Book of Mormon, admittedly, and I consider that to be a sort of a moral foundation of my life. And it's one of those rare things that it really has been the case for me, that I feel like the more I study it, the more it opens itself to me. And so that if I mean, I've taught about a lot of things, but like right now, I'm teaching a class about the King Benjamin's sermon, and that is deeply meaningful to me. But really, I like teaching all of the parts of the Book of Mormon.
And the whole class is just about the sermon?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's incredible.
I like to do it that way. I mean, there are lots of ways to teach things, but the moving through it, like, it sort of breaks my heart, honestly, that now, with Sunday school only every other week, and then you have to try to move through an entire book in a year. It's like you end up getting like 10 chapters in a week or something. And I mean, I get that it is what it is, but it seems very difficult to deeply appreciate any religious text at 10 chapters in an hour.
Yeah. Well, if I know anything, I know it'll change. So if that gives you any sort of hope, there is that. The second question that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall, if you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
I would probably pick being an institute teacher. I mean, I'm just being honest. I really, really love it. And I've been lucky to do it for a long time. So I consider myself, I mean, as I said, I have had other callings as well, but I really love being able to teach. And I think that, college kids are at a sort of a perfect place in the sense that they might be a little more awake than some seminary classes, let's say, and also are sort of in this place where they're, I think for a lot of people, colleges where it's like, oh my gosh, there's this whole world of ideas, and I didn't know about all these, philosophers and whatever. And so I think it's a very like open, and it's a time that's full of rigorous thinking. And I think that it's kind of a sweet spot in terms of being able to teach at exactly that level I really love.
Well, and a tremendous amount of responsibility. I can remember institute teachers that I had, because it's the first time that many people are living away from home, and they're like, I can do whatever I want. I can be able to do it. And they're very much, if they're anything like me, not that I ever did this, of course, but I was like, maybe I want to do these things. Do I like this? Oh, I do.
I mean, it's it feels, I think for a lot of people, it's like the first time you have live options, right? It's the first time you're actually like, oh, I can just wake up in the morning and decide what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially with that church piece. I remember kind of that first Sunday in college where I was like, is this apartment? I lived with 5 other guys. Are we church people? Do we go? A couple of us were, a couple of us weren't, but it was just like, you're not going to tell anyone, are you? Like, if I don't go, if I just sleep, it was an odd step into being an adult. The final question that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall, we ask you to interpret it however you may. But the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
So I'm going to answer that this way. I think that culturally, and sometimes even religiously, we've done a real disservice to ourselves in creating a fairy tale version of the gospel that looks like if you sort of try hard and do these things and don't do these things, then everything will turn out in this kind of Nordstrom catalog sort of a way. And my favorite thing about my faith is that I believe that because of God's perfect love, as manifested most importantly through the gift of uh, our heavenly parent son, Jesus Christ, you can, the fairy tale can burn down. It can be totally obliterated, and there is still a meaningful, substantive, true thing even after all of that fairy tale has gone away.
Hmm. You know, something else strikes me as you were talking, and I want to ask this question. I normally don't. Normally that's the end, and then we wrap this thing up. But I hear tell from a lot of people that are in the medical field or around doctors that there are a lot of members of the church who will engage in being a doctor or a surgeon or any of that, and then they find themselves kind of stepping away from the church. I don't know if it's hubris or if it's, you know, something else. What as you have been professionally, what have you learned professionally that has helped you faithfully or religiously, if you want to couch it that way?
Yeah, so I don't want anyone, even implicitly in the context of that question, to somehow think that, well, you know, I'm the guy who chose to be faithful or something, because it's not like that. It's just that, um, you know, I remember a number of years ago, I took care of a young guy who was diagnosed with biopsy proven metastatic stomach cancer when he was 19 years old.
Boof.
So incurable stomach cancer. And happily, he did actually miraculously well for about 3.5 years. And then eventually the treatment stopped working and he died when he was probably 24 or something. Um, you know, that's really terrible. And there's no, to the point we were making at the beginning, like there's no thing to say to make that not terrible. There's no like different way to look at it that lessens the unanswerable questions that arise when something like that happens. But and so part of what I'm saying is that those kinds of questions, because of my job, they're not theoretical for me. Like it, you know, it's not like something I'll think about when I'm old and, you know, ready to die or something. Like I'm talking with people about those kinds of things all day, every week. And so that's just to say that I feel a need for that. I feel a need for spiritual support. I feel a need for faith. And it's complicated, it's hard. Often it doesn't make any sense. It's all of those things, but I don't think all of those things change the fact that all of us need a way to be in community and to grapple with life's most unanswerable questions. And it's not that I think, you know, the gospel gives a nice, like, here's the 1, 2, 3, 4 answers to the hard questions of life, although there's also a unhelpful way to think that. But I think that it offers sort of a, you know, through a glass darkly way of believing that there are meaningful answers even when life is filled with suffering.
Glad I asked that question. Tyler, we talked about a lot of things in this episode. One, I want to let people know that they can find a link to purchase your book. That will be in the show notes. You mentioned Melissa Inouye. We had the opportunity to interview her before she passed. People can find a link to that very special interview that we did. Richard Bushman also has been in the Cultural Hall talking about rough stone rolling and some of his other things. You can find a link for that as well as that book. And Paul Reeve, most recently with his book, Abominable Slavery. You were mentioning Race and the Priesthood is the book that you were talking about, also printed by Deseret Book, and you can find a link for that in the show notes as well. Tyler, I hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, Rick McGee, Debbie Wanless, Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and the Tiger with a U will be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back row. We really gotta go on the Cultural Hall show.